It's a humid May morning in Tulagi, the Solomon Islands. Rear Admiral Kiyohi Deshima watches as his troops hustle on the docks, unloading supplies and equipment from the ships that brought them. The air buzzes with excitement as they establish a vital base for the Imperial Navy. Just as the final crates are set ashore, they notice the rumble of aircraft engines in the distance. Shima steels himself, aware that the operation's success hinges on rapidly securing the island. In December 1941, Japan launched simultaneous surprise attacks on Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Pearl Harbor. Japan's strategy was to eliminate British and American forces from Southeast Asia and establish self-sufficiency by securing resource-rich territories. By early 1942, Japan had successfully taken control of several key regions, including the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. They planned to use these areas as defensive perimeters to protect their empire from Allied counterattacks. Following the capture of Leh and Salamaua in March, American air attacks disrupted Japanese advances, leading to a pause until reinforcements could be gathered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the key figure shaping Japan's naval strategy. Known for his aggressive and risk-taking nature, Yamamoto strongly believed in naval air power and commanded the combined fleet starting in 1939. He focused on a decisive battle at Midway, sidelining the South Pacific campaign, but not everyone agreed. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the Fourth Fleet and an advocate of air power, had overseen the successful capture of Guam and Wake Island. He proposed further expanding Japan's control by occupying Tulagi in the Solomon Islands and Port Moresby in New Guinea to extend the range of Japanese aircraft over northern Australia. Port Moresby was a vital Australian-American stronghold situated on the southeastern coast of New Guinea, just across the Coral Sea from the Australian mainland. Despite reservations about expanding into the South Pacific, Yamamoto approved the attack on Port Moresby. This plan, known as Operation MO, aimed to secure the port by May and establish further bases to cut communication lines between Australia and the US. Following the completion of this operation, plans were set in motion for an offensive targeting the Midway and Aleutian Islands, designed to entice the remnants of America's Pacific Fleet, particularly its aircraft carriers, into a deadly trap. The Japanese prepared a large invasion force, with Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue conducting operations from a distance from his base in Rabaul. The invasion force included 11 transport ships carrying 5,000 soldiers and 500 naval troops. This fleet, led by Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, set out on May 4th, aiming to reach Port Moresby by May 10th. Supporting this invasion was the Tulagi Invasion Force, led by Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima, which targeted the Solomon Islands with a similar group of ships. But these two invasion forces, supported by a close cover force, were just a minor part of a much larger Japanese fleet. Beyond the invasion and close support units, Japan's force included the important covering group led by the seasoned Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. He began the war leading Cruiser Squadron 6, which comprised the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4 oldest heavy cruisers from the Furutaka and Aoba classes. He was an experienced commander, and since the start of the war he already conducted operations against key locations, including Guam, Wake, and Rabaul. Goto's group was tasked with safeguarding the Port Moresby invasion force and comprised the light aircraft carrier Shoho, 4 cruisers, and a destroyer. Originally launched as an oiler and later converted into a submarine tender, Shoho was modified into a 30-plane carrier just months prior. Besides Goto's force, there was a carrier striking force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi. Takagi, a former submarine specialist, transitioned to the Surface Navy in 1937 and gained flag rank in 1938. By 1941, he commanded the 5th Cruiser Division, leading its powerful Myoko-class cruisers. He played a key role in Japan's victory at the Battle of the Java Sea in February. Now, he commanded the MO Carrier Striking Force, despite having never worked with carries. Acknowledging this, he delegated carrier operations to the experienced Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, the commander of the 5th Carrier Division. Hara emerged as the key Japanese commander. Known for his fiery temperament, he earned the nickname King Kong. A surface warfare officer, he took command of the 5th Carrier Division by September 1941. This included the Imperial Japanese Navy's 2 newest and most advanced aircraft carriers, the Shōkaku and Zuikaku. This division played a role both during the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raid. By May 1942, Hara had amassed considerable carrier experience in a remarkably brief period. Interestingly, the captains of the 2 primary Japanese carriers at Coral Sea deviated from the traditional practice of having aviators in command. Captain Yokogawa Ichihei commanded the carrier Zuikaku, while Captain Jojima Takagi led the carrier Shokaku. These large carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, were accompanied by 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers. These sister carriers, completed the previous year, were larger and better armored than any Japanese aircraft carriers that had come before them, each capable of carrying 72 aircraft. They were powerful and well-balanced carriers. Designed without treaty restrictions, they featured a large air group, high speed, good protection, and excellent offensive and defensive capabilities, marking them as the most advanced carrier design until the Essex class emerged in 1943. In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force was at its peak, with 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, the Soryu class, and the Shokaku class dominating the Pacific. Supported by light carriers like Hosho, Ryujo, and Taiyo, the fleet had yet to face the US Navy's carriers and held a clear numerical and qualitative advantage. Japanese carriers were designed for offensive operations, emphasizing finding and striking enemy carriers first with their longer-range, lighter aircraft. The Kido Butai combined multiple carriers for coordinated strikes, giving the Japanese an early advantage. However, by mid-1942, aircraft shortages began affecting carrier air groups, especially on light carriers like Shoho, which was not filled to capacity anymore. Japanese carrier aircraft such as the A6M0 fighter, D3A Val dive bomber, and B5N Kate torpedo bomber had excellent range and performance, but lacked protection, making them vulnerable to damage despite their initial successes. Furthermore, these carriers lacked radar, making air defense subject to visual detection and estimates. Fighter squadrons were tasked with patrols, but with no radar, only a few planes could stay airborne, relying on visual detection. Additionally, poor quality radios hampered effective fighter coordination. Japanese anti-aircraft gunnery was inadequate compared to the US Navy. The primary anti-aircraft weapon, the Type 89 5-inch gun, was limited by its fire control and barrage fire training, unsuitable for fast-moving targets like dive bombers. The Type 96 25mm gun also struggled, unable to handle high-speed aircraft due to slow targeting and ineffective shells. Meanwhile, by April, the US and British codebreakers had unraveled parts of Japan's naval codes. Their intelligence efforts unveiled plans for a Japanese offensive aimed at Australia. Despite being short on carriers due to the Doolittle raid, a bombing campaign targeting Tokyo conducted by the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Texas-born commander of the US Pacific Fleet, decided to gamble on the element of surprise. Chester Nimitz became the commander of the US Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941, after graduating from the Naval Academy in 1905 and gaining experience primarily with submarines. His calm demeanor led to his selection over more senior admirals following the Pearl Harbor attack. On April 3rd, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, overseeing operations across the North, Central, and South Pacific. However, this new command structure complicated his authority, as he had to share command in the South Pacific with Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, who'd not yet arrived by the time of planning this operation. Upon learning of Japan's offensive, Nimitz's aggressive nature emerged. He pressed for the deployment of a second carrier to counter Japanese expansion in the South Pacific, ultimately proposing that all Pacific Fleet carriers be sent to the region for a decisive carrier battle. Admiral William Halsey, who was still en route from the Doolittle raid, would likely not return in time for the battle. The surface force was clustered in what would become Task Force 17, commanded by the Iowa-born, seasoned, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1906, Fletcher initially served on destroyers and earned the Medal of Honor during the U.S. occupation of Veracruz in 1915. By the time the war broke out, he commanded Cruiser Division 6, but his transition to carrier operations was abrupt due to the war's onset, as he had no prior aviation experience and had been rejected for transfer to naval aviation due to poor eyesight. Despite this, Fletcher became one of the Navy's most seasoned carrier commanders through several months of experience. His leadership style was controversial. He faced criticism for a perceived lack of aggressiveness, especially during operations like the relief of Wake Island and the Guadalcanal landings. Nevertheless, he was willing to take calculated risks. Fletcher delegated tactical control of the carrier task force to Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who commanded the Lexington Task Force. Although junior to Fletcher, Fitch had substantial carrier experience, having qualified as a pilot in 1930 at age 47, earning him the nickname Johnny Come Lately. He had commanded 2 carriers and 2 naval air stations, proving to be a competent naval officer. The captains of the 2 American carriers, Yorktown and Lexington, were both naval aviators. Captain Elliot Buckmaster of Yorktown was known for his seamanship and for fostering an environment that allowed his aviators to experiment, leading to one of the fleet's best air groups. Captain Frederick Ted Sherman of Lexington had commanded the ship for 2 years, enhancing its efficiency and advocating for the concentration of multiple carriers in a single task force. Supporting these forces was Australian Rear Admiral John Crace's Task Force 17.3. His forces included cruisers Australia, Hobart and Chicago, along with destroyers Perkins and Walkie. The US Navy's fleet carrier force was numerically equal to Japan's, but the 2 forces differed in operational strategies, aircraft capabilities, and personnel training. The US Navy had developed carrier aviation since the 1920s, with 7 fleet carriers in service, built around 2 main classes, including the Lexington class. By 1940, Lexington, affectionately known as Lady Lex, had been modernized with a wider fore and a CXAM radar. It was heavily armed with anti-aircraft weapons, including 5-inch guns and quadruple 1.1-inch mounts, and featured an 888-foot flight deck with a capacity for 71 planes. The Yorktown, completed in 1936, boasted an impressive 824-foot flight deck and was equipped to carry 72 aircraft. They were the first modern US Navy fleet carriers, serving as a foundation for the later Essex class. These 20,000-ton ships featured improved protection, including a 4-inch side armor belt over critical areas and vertical protection over machinery spaces. Their design emphasized efficient flight operations with a large hangar deck, 3 deck elevators, and roller curtains to speed up aircraft launches. The class also had a robust anti-aircraft defense, with 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 1.1-inch quadruple mounts, and machine guns. By the Battle of Coral Sea, Yorktown received upgraded 20mm guns and radar technology, specifically the CXAM air search radar. US carrier air groups consisted of 4 squadrons: fighter, scout, dive bomber, and torpedo. The F-4F Wildcat was the main fighter, compensating for its inferior performance to the Japanese Zero with superior gunnery and tactics. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber was a key asset, known for its bombing accuracy. The outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, hampered by unreliable torpedoes, highlighted the weaknesses in US carrier strike capabilities early in the war. The Royal Australian Air Force's 11th and 12th Squadrons, each at half strength with a total of 6 PBY Catalina aircraft, were stationed on Tulagi until May 2nd. The 32nd General Reconnaissance Bomber Squadron operated Hudsons, while the 75th Squadron, stationed at Port Moresby, had 3 operational P-40 aircraft as of April 30th. Overall, the 4 squadrons had 30 operational aircraft at the start of the battle. On April 28th, Japan established a seaplane base at Shortland Island, deploying 5 long-range H-6K4 flying boats for scouting. Its Tulagi invasion force departed Rabaul on April 29th, followed by the MO carrier striking force on May 1st. That same day, Fletcher rendezvoused with Fitch's Task Force 11, located 300 miles south of Tulagi. A few days later, Crace's flotilla merged into what would become Task Force 17 under Fletcher's overall command. As Fletcher steered toward the Coral Sea, Halsey arrived in Pearl Harbor only to learn he would soon set off for the South Pacific. He immediately embarked on a grueling 3,500-mile race across the Pacific to the Coral Sea. Should he arrive in time to engage, he would assume command of all 4 carriers, including the Yorktown and Lexington. However, he was still 6 days away from reaching the battle zone. On May 2nd, a scout plane from the Yorktown reported a Japanese submarine surfacing directly ahead of the task force. 3 additional patrolling aircraft quickly converged on the scene, deploying bombs in an attempt to engage the enemy. However, the submarine managed to evade capture and reported the presence of the Americans. Shortly thereafter, Fletcher received intelligence of enemy vessels to the northwest. The Lexington force was still in the process of refueling when Fletcher decided to advance with his own group to intercept the approaching Japanese. This move, however, left the US carrier groups dangerously separated by nearly 100 miles and out of contact due to strict radio silence. The following day, Japanese forces under Rear Admiral Kyohei Shima occupied Tulagi in the Solomon Islands without opposition, as the small Australian garrison evacuated beforehand. The Japanese immediately began constructing a seaplane and communications base. Shima found his troops in a vulnerable position, lacking the vital air cover it once had. The light carrier Shoho had moved northward to protect the convoy destined for Port Moresby, while the MO carrier striking force remained near Rabaul, entangled in a difficult ferry mission. Fletcher learned of the invasion in the evening. It prompted him to hasten his advance northward, opting to proceed independently rather than waiting for Fitch or Crace. This maneuver split his forces even more, rendering them vulnerable to a substantial Japanese offensive. On the morning of May 4th, shortly after 7 a.m., Yorktown launched 12 Devastator torpedo planes and 28 Dauntless dive bombers, flying without the protection of fighter escorts. The poor weather conditions worked in their favor, providing heavy cloud cover for most of their journey. As Yorktown's planes headed north, Admirals Fitch's Task Force 11 and Crace's Task Force 44 prepared to close the 250-mile gap separating them from Fletcher. On that quiet morning in Tulagi Harbor, several Japanese ships lay anchored as troops on land were busy unloading their vessels. The large mine layer Okinoshima and 2 destroyers stood out as prime objectives. At 8:15 a.m., Lieutenant Commander William O. Birch's force arrived near Tulagi. The bombing raid against Shima's forces commenced soon after. The Devastators, tasked with launching torpedoes, proved ineffective, managing to hit only 1 minesweeper. The first wave lasted only a few minutes. Among the notable outcomes of this first wave was the crippling of the destroyer Kikuzuki, which later had to be beached and ultimately lost. The assault continued. By noon, 27 dive bombers and 11 torpedo bombers launched a second attack, targeting installations across the island. A third wave followed with 21 dive bombers. Adding to the effort, a group of 4 fighters was dispatched to strafe the Type 97 flying boats and the newly established seaplane anchorage. Although the bombing raids initially seemed promising, most bombs and torpedoes did miss their target. By nightfall, the day of bombing raids was over. Fletcher received hopeful reports from his aviators, who had inflated their success. He relayed to Nimitz that he had sunk 2 enemy destroyers, 4 patrol craft, 3 gunboats, and a cargo ship, while severely damaging a light cruiser and half a dozen Type 97 flying boats. However, reality was far more sobering. In total, the destroyer Kikuzuki, 3 light minesweepers, and several smaller vessels were obliterated. The Japanese lost 87 killed and 124 wounded. Perhaps the most significant achievement was the elimination of 5 Type 97 flying boats, depriving the Japanese of valuable reconnaissance assets. This came at the cost of 3 US aircraft. After striking Tulagi, Fletcher retreated south at high speed, evading Japanese retaliation. Although no major damage was done, the airstrike on Tulagi prompted a swift reaction from the Japanese, who now recognized with considerable alarm that at least one American carrier was operating in the vicinity. Far to the east, Japanese Admiral Takagi's striking force with the carriers Zuikaku and Shōkaku was advancing rapidly across the Pacific Ocean, aiming to cut off any Allied vessels in the region. Following a separate but converging path, Japanese Admiral Goto's fleet maneuvered to position itself along the western side of the Solomons, hoping to trap the Allied forces between them. History's first aircraft carrier battle was about to break out. It's a tense May morning in the Coral Sea. Aboard the USS Sims, Captain Wilford M. Hyman scans the horizon, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. His ship and the oiler, Neosho, have been detached from the larger force to refuel. The sea is calm, the mission routine. However, the quiet doesn't last. In the distance, a formation of enemy planes emerges, low over the waves. Hyman's heart races. His ship, unprepared for battle, is about to face overwhelming odds. He shouts orders as the crew scrambles into position. The sky darkens with enemy bombers. The attack is imminent. On the morning of May 4, 1942, Fletcher's task force had launched an airstrike on Tulagi, but despite a decent effort, the results were underwhelming. After striking Tulagi, Fletcher retreated south at high speed, evading Japanese retaliation. Admiral Fitch's Task Force 11 and Crace's Task Force 44 spent almost 2 full days bridging the 250-mile gap and joined Fletcher's Task Force 17 on May 5th, reuniting the forces without much happening in between. The carrier plane's unimpressive strike against Tulagi was enough to catch the attention of the Japanese, who swiftly responded. Alarmed by the presence of an American carrier, Admiral Takagi, commanding the carrier striking force, along with a strong escort, began operations to hunt down and eliminate the threat in the Coral Sea. For 2 days, the opposing fleets scoured the Coral Sea without making contact, coming alarmingly close to each other on May 6th. Takagi's carriers were not flying patrols that morning. On that day, a Japanese land-based search plane successfully identified Fletcher's location, but the critical intelligence failed to reach Takagi in a timely manner, having been routed through Rabaul rather than delivered directly. The forces came within a mere 70 miles, yet both remained unaware of their proximity. As night fell, Japanese forces, with Admiral Goto aboard the light carrier Shoho, began advancing toward Port Moresby, while Takagi temporarily withdrew to the east, refueling his ships aboard the heavy cruiser Myoko. The following morning, Fletcher and Takagi dispatched their search planes once more, scanning the Pacific for signs of the enemy. Fletcher was positioned 150 miles south of Rossell Island, situated between 2 Japanese forces, Sadamichi's invasion force to the north and Goto's main force to the northwest. Meanwhile, the Japanese carrier striking force was approximately 300 miles southwest of Tulagi, around 200 miles southeast of Fletcher, who mistakenly believed the Japanese carriers were south of Bougainville. While Fletcher's scouts were scanning, he divided his forces once more. He directed Crace's group, comprising the Australian cruisers Australia and Hobart, the US cruiser Chicago, and 3 American destroyers northwest to block Japanese forces at Jomard Passage. Fletcher believed that neutralizing the Japanese forces in a carrier battle would allow Crace to contest any further Japanese advances. This maneuver meant that Crace's ships would operate without air cover, a risky position, while Task Force 17 would be deprived of 30% of its anti-aircraft firepower. Meanwhile, the elements from Yorktown and Lexington shifted northward to engage the enemy carriers. Fletcher's decision to detach Crace's squadron has faced scrutiny for undermining his fleet's defenses, with some suggesting it stemmed from anti-British and anti-Australian bias. Fletcher's staff chief claimed the detachment was motivated by a desire to ensure that only American officers received medals. While this seems unlikely, evidence suggests Fletcher favored separating Crace's squadron, influenced by discussions about Crace's preference for independent command. While this was ongoing, by 7:36 a.m., a Japanese pilot sighted the tanker Neosho and her escort, the destroyer Sims. Fletcher had moved the valuable and nearly empty oiler, Neosho, affectionately nicknamed the Fat Lady, and the destroyer Sims out of the danger zone the day before, after refueling his carrier. The American vessels were ill-prepared for any kind of battle. Eager to deliver good news to Tulagi, the Japanese pilot mistakenly identified the pair as an aircraft carrier and a cruiser. The report aligned perfectly with Commander Chuichi Hara's assessment of the Americans' potential location. This erroneous report sent a ripple through Takagi's command. Armed with the false intelligence, Takagi ordered an all-out attack. At 8 o'clock, the Japanese launched almost every plane from their two carriers. By 8:15, an aerial force of 78 aircraft was mobilized, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Kakuichi. From Zuikaku, 37 aircraft were deployed, 9 Zeros, 17 Vals, and 11 Kates. Shōkaku committed 41 aircraft, including Takahashi's Val, 9 Zeros, 19 Vals, and 13 Kates. Aside from the 12 Kates on reconnaissance flights and 19 Zeros retained for combat air patrol, every operational aircraft was committed to this strike. Upon reaching the reported coordinates, just after 9 o'clock, Takahashi discovered only an oiler and its escort. A broader search of the surrounding area yielded no additional targets. He halted the attack and requested clarification. Based on earlier scout reports, Hara informed him that an oiler and destroyer had been spotted near the carrier force. To ensure thoroughness, the strike leader decided to split his formations. He kept the dive bombers within sight of the oiler, while sending the torpedo bombers and escorting fighters to search for the carrier group. It took only minutes for the detached torpedo bombers to cover the 25 nautical miles to the northwest, only to find an empty ocean beneath them. While this absence of a target did not conclusively indicate that there had never been a carrier force in that location, the report was now an hour and a half old. It became increasingly clear to the Japanese commanders, from Admiral Inoue down, that the southern contact reported by Shokaku's scouts was likely a misidentification of a small replenishment group. Takahashi continued to search for non-existent American carriers despite receiving orders to return. Finally, at 11:15, he ordered the Zeros and Kates home, over 2 hours after spotting the Neosho and Sims. He then directed 36 Vals to attack these support vessels. Aboard the US ships, the Japanese had not gone unnoticed. Neosho, commanded by Captain John S. Phillips, had first detected enemy aircraft at 7:40, observing multiple planes approximately 10 nautical miles to the north-northeast. Phillips misjudged the aircraft as friendly, believing he had been sent to a location secure from enemy interference, and thus did not report the sighting to Fletcher's task force. Sims was equipped with air search radar, noticing the approaching larger Japanese force. Yet, at 9:35, when 15 enemy aircraft appeared briefly before disappearing from sight, or at 9:53 when another 7 Japanese planes were observed, neither Sims nor Neosho reached out to Fletcher's task force. On both occasions, Sims did open fire with its 5-inch dual-purpose main battery against the enemy aircraft. These flew at high altitude, and Sims failed to score any hits. 20 minutes later, the situation escalated. At 10:35, 3 bombers dropped 3 bombs simultaneously. The Neosho swung hard right to avoid being hit. All bombs fell to starboard and were near misses. Captain Phillips finally reported to Fletcher that he was being bombed. However, there was little Fletcher's task force could do, except anxiously await the results of the battle, as both ships were beyond the reach of any US planes. At 11:26, the Vals initiated their assault on the oiler and destroyer. The defensive fire from both ships was minimal, offering little protection as the enemy planes approached unopposed from the north. The situation quickly escalated into chaos, with the crew of Sims trying their best to evade the bombs. The initial wave, consisting of 15 bombers, failed to inflict damage on the 2 vessels, which were deftly maneuvering. Observers noted approximately 24 enemy planes advancing. The ships continued firing, altering their courses in desperate attempts to avoid the dive bombing strikes that rained down from both fore and stern. The timeline of the assault, as recorded by Sims's senior surviving Chief Petty Officer, Robert J. Dicken, indicated that within 10 to 15 minutes, the focus of the attack shifted entirely to Sims. The Vals strafed and bombed the Sims, which was positioned behind and to the left of the oiler. At 12:05, a near miss rendered the destroyer's gyro compass inoperative, and just 4 minutes later, she suffered a direct hit amidships, resulting in a violent explosion and flames erupting from the vessel. The precision of the Japanese assault was striking. At approximately 12:15, a bomb struck near the after torpedo tubes, penetrating the deck and exploding within the aft engine room. The force buckled the deck, while additional hits compromised the ship's structure, damaging critical systems and forcing personnel to evacuate the bridge. Sims was overwhelmed. Dicken, now acting on instinct, organized a rescue effort, abandoning ship to swim to a whaleboat where he began to collect personnel who had fallen into the water. As sailors were departing the destroyer, a barrage of 3 550-pound bombs struck home. The first struck the second torpedo mount, detonating in the forward engine room. The second exploded in the aft engine room after hitting the upper deck, while the third obliterated the fourth naval gun. In under a minute, the destroyer was torn in half, rapidly sinking, claiming the lives of dozens of crew members. A sailor who had been cast into the water recalled seeing the captain, Lieutenant Commander Wilford M. Hyman, standing stoically on the bridge, riding her down like one of the captains of old. Moments later, a massive explosion sent the remnants of the Sims 10 feet into the air, leaving behind only 68 survivors. The remaining dive bombers then turned their focus to Neosho. They straddled her, strafing and bombing the limping ship. Their bullets tore through the tanker's deck and hull, igniting a torrent of flaming fuel across its deck. One of the Japanese pilots executed what is believed to be the first kamikaze attack of the Pacific War, crashing into Neosho's fourth gun station, or its stern. Japanese pilot Hori Kenji later recounted the moment, describing how his classmate, Shigeo Ishizuka, was struck while diving, bursting into flames before crashing into the bridge of the oil tanker. Throughout the assault, Neosho endured an astonishing amount of damage, suffering 7 direct bomb hits from 250 kilograms bombs. Each strike further compromised the vessel's integrity, creating significant breaches in the hull and leading to oil flooding the engine room. Notably, the combination of being mostly empty, filled primarily with air, and the crew's experienced response helped to avert an immediate disaster. Despite the destruction, the ship's machine gunners continued their desperate defense, even as 2 of them were instantly killed, one decapitated by flying debris. Captain Phillips remained on the bridge, issuing orders to flood the after magazines and extinguish the flames ravaging the deck. As the last of the Vals departed, an order by Phillips to prepare to abandon ship led to confusion. Miscommunication ensued, causing many crew members to leap overboard, believing the order to abandon ship had already been given. Phillips ordered the launch of 2 motor whaleboats to recover survivors from the water and the life rafts. Although the conditions at sea were rough, the officers in command worked to gather as many men as possible, prioritizing the injured while neglecting to tow the life rafts back to the ship. As sunset approached, the boats returned filled to capacity with survivors, many suffering severe injuries. Phillips was left with a severely damaged ship, listing 30 degrees to port, aflame, and devoid of power. The crew continued battling the raging inferno on board, using flood valves on several starboard wing tanks in a desperate attempt to right the vessel. The sky quieted down again. The attack had lasted 18 minutes. The battle claimed between 180 and 235 lives from Sims, and another 179 from Neosho. For Takagi, the cost had been minimal, sources conflict, but he likely lost between 2 and 6 planes. However, he had lost valuable time. In preparation for abandoning ship, all classified materials, including sensitive cipher documents, had been destroyed. This precaution meant that when the vessel did not sink immediately, and the engineers managed to power up a small gasoline generator, the subsequent radio transmissions were sent in plain language. One crucial message misrepresented the Neosho's position. reporting it as 15 nautical miles north and 30 nautical miles east of its actual location, hindering rescue efforts by misdirecting searching vessels. It wasn't until May 11th that the destroyer Henley finally located the battered oiler, rescuing 123 survivors before sinking the wreck with torpedoes. Neosho and Sims had unwittingly absorbed the blows meant for larger targets, allowing Admiral Fletcher's carriers to remain untouched. Yet Fletcher faced a different problem. He had not yet located the Japanese fleet. The operation had been a disappointment. Takagi's forces had spent the morning hunting secondary vessels instead of the elusive American carriers. Hara received another report 45 minutes after Takagi's aircraft were dispatched. A Japanese float plane from the cruiser Kinugasa accurately reported the presence of an American carrier and several other vessels to the southeast of Rossel Island. Among them, a correctly identified Lexington-class carrier. As Takagi's strike force raced toward the wrong target, Admiral Goto received even more reliable intelligence. At 8:20 a.m., one of his scout planes pinpointed the exact location of Task Force 17, yet despite the clarity of the report, Goto found himself constrained. His air strength was too limited to mount an offensive, and his primary mission was to safeguard the Port Moresby invasion force, which was now only 30 miles away. Finally, at 10:42, Takagi ordered the fleet to reverse course. 9 minutes later, Hara conceded, instructing the strike group to return, admitting the earlier target, the tanker and destroyer, had been mistaken for a carrier. This was frustrating to Takagi, Hara and Goto, but what was severely worrying was that the Japanese scout plane correctly identifying Task Force 17 reported empty carriers. This meant the task force was likely in the process of launching its own strike against the Japanese. Because around that same time, a breakthrough seemed imminent for Fletcher. A reconnaissance plane from Yorktown had reported 2 enemy carriers and 4 heavy cruisers 225 miles to the northwest. Convinced he had found Takagi's main fleet, Fletcher immediately ordered a full attack. One of the first major engagements of the Battle of the Coral Sea was about to break out. It's a clear May morning aboard the heavy cruiser Aoba. Rear Admiral Goto scans the horizon as his convoy, including the light carrier Shoho, moves steadily north. His forces are preparing to launch a strike against the Americans. Suddenly, word comes that enemy aircraft have been spotted. Goto watches in disbelief as Shoho scrambles to launch her few available fighters. The sky above erupts with American dive bombers. Within moments, Goto's officers bark orders, sailors rapidly taking their battle stations as Shoho becomes the dive bombers' target. The first major engagement of the Battle of the Coral Sea has begun. Takagi's operation faltered as his forces spent the morning pursuing minor vessels, missing the American carriers. At 8:20 a.m., Goto received precise intelligence pinpointing Task Force 17, but he couldn't act due to limited air strength. Even more worrying was the report by heavy cruiser Kinugasa's scout aircraft at 10:08. They reported Task Force 17 was in the process of launching its own strike, because around that same time, a breakthrough seemed imminent for Fletcher. A reconnaissance plane flown by Lieutenant Nielsen from Yorktown reported 2 enemy carriers and 4 heavy cruisers 225 miles to the northwest. This Japanese force was beyond the operational range of the American fighters and torpedo planes. However, with the Japanese fleet moving south and Fletcher's forces heading north, he assessed that a full-scale attack was feasible. Shortly after the final group of 93 aircraft, consisting of Dauntlesses, Devastators, and Wildcats, cleared the decks of Lexington and Yorktown, the scout plane that had transmitted the earlier message about 2 carriers returned. The pilot, it turned out, had mistakenly identified 2 cruisers and an auxiliary gunboat as carriers, a critical error stemming from coding confusion. It was a far cry from the carriers. Upon receiving the corrected report, Fletcher's frustration boiled over. He angrily stated the mistake could have cost the US 2 carriers. His pilots were now flying towards minor targets while Takagi's carriers remained unchecked, likely closing in on his own fleet. Hesitant to break radio silence, Fletcher opted not to recall his aerial strike force. It was a decision similar as his Japanese counterpart, Admiral Hara, had made that same morning. Just before 1100, the light aircraft carrier Shoho was moving southeast, preparing for an attack on a US carrier force sighted earlier. With limited aircraft, 5 Zeros, 4 Claudes, and 6 Kates, Captain Izawa readied his fighters and launched them as replacements for air cover. Meanwhile, the Japanese cruisers formed a defensive formation around Shoho. The Shoho-class ships, initially designed as high-speed oilers, underwent significant transformations to serve in a far different capacity. Shoho herself was originally completed as a submarine tender, but her true purpose lay in her potential to be quickly converted into a light aircraft carrier. This conversion began in January 1941, and by the following year, Shoho was ready to join the Imperial Japanese Navy alongside her sister ship, Zuaho. These ships emerged as the most successful light carrier conversions for Japan. The conversion process was relatively straightforward. Shoho's original diesel engines were replaced with turbines typically found in destroyers. A flight deck was constructed atop the existing structure, equipped with 2 elevators that serviced a single hangar deck. Notably, the ship lacked an island structure for command purposes. Instead, navigation was carried out from a position forward of the hangar. Upon completion, Shoho boasted respectable speed and an operationally useful air group, yet the vessel was critically lacking in protection. Her defensive capabilities were minimal, outfitted with 4 twin-mounted Type 89 5-inch guns. Her anti-aircraft defenses were limited to just 4 triple-mounted 25mm guns, an armament considered insufficient by many. That morning, she was preparing to launch a small strike against Task Force 17 when the incoming American strike force was detected. At that moment, Shoho had only 1 Type 0 and 2 Type 96 fighters airborne. She had just recovered her 4-plane combat air patrol and a carrier attack plane. At approximately 10:40, 15 Dauntlesses spotted the enemy ships approximately 40 miles north, recognizing the carrier by its distinct light-colored flight deck. As the American strike group closed in, they identified Shoho and several other ships, including heavy cruisers and a destroyer, albeit with some confusion due to the distance and haze. Leading the assault was the 3-plane command section of the land-based air group, spearheaded by Commander Bill Alt in his Dauntless dive bomber. As they approached from the south at an altitude of 10,000 feet, Alt executed a steep dive. He was closely followed by 2 more aircraft, their 1,200 horsepower engines roaring, with their perforated diving brakes deployed to stabilize and slow their descent. Trailing Alt were 2 Wildcats, commanded by Lieutenant Junior Grade Willard E. Eder. They joined the dive, only to find the skies relatively clear, apart from a weak and ineffective barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Captain Izawa prepared for the attack by initiating evasive maneuvers. He knew he had to anticipate the bomber's trajectory and begin turning the ship before the first bombs fell, yet he was cautious not to reveal his intentions too early before sharply turning starboard. As the SBDs dove, Izawa claimed to shoot down one, but this was inaccurate. Alt's planes released their bombs from a height of 1,000 meters, with some landing alarmingly close, within 20 to 50 meters. But no damage was inflicted on Shoho. With no strike coordinator in place, the aviators all converged on the carrier, leaving the cruisers untouched. Caught off guard, Shoho had planes still on her deck when the Americans arrived. With many of their aircraft grounded for servicing after conducting scouting and cover missions, the Japanese relied heavily on evasive maneuvers and anti-aircraft fire to fend off the approaching American bombers. A chaotic air battle ensued as Japanese fighters scrambled to defend Shoho, but the Americans pressed on. While no direct bomb hits were recorded during the first strike, the force of the exploding 500-pound bombs blew 5 planes off the stern of the Shoho's flight deck. As the carrier sharply turned to port, into the wind, to launch her aircraft, she became an easy target. As Lieutenant Dixon led his squadron of 10 SBDs around to the east, they descended, picking up speed as they maneuvered towards Shoho. They soon attracted the attention of Japanese defenders. fighter aircraft lunged at the first Dauntlesses as they began their dives. A lone Type 0 fighter managed to damage one Dauntless during its dive and shot down another as it pulled out of its attack. Shoho made a sharp port turn, complicating the attacker's aim. 2 hits were later claimed, one near the ramp and another in the center of the flight deck. These assertions were confirmed by multiple observers, yet the truth revealed that all of VS-2's bombs had missed. As the remaining Dauntlesses withdrew, pursued briefly by 3 fighters, a momentary pause ensued. However, Captain Izawa and his crew knew the threat was far from over. More dive bombers loomed high above, and the slower torpedo bombers approached. In a last-ditch effort to fortify Shoho's meager combat air patrol, Izawa commanded the carrier to align into the wind. 3 Zeros, freshly serviced and waiting on the flight deck, prepared for the oncoming assault. The US torpedo planes split into 2 divisions, advancing toward the carrier from both the east and west. Simultaneously, bombers were descending from 16,000 feet, approaching from the east. As they reached 12,000 feet and positioned themselves 3,500 feet upwind from the carrier with the sun overhead, the first aircraft began their dives. Pilots of the bombers noted the absence of defensive fire from the cruisers as they began their attack. This lack of opposition likely stemmed from the lengthy gap between assaults, leaving the Japanese to anticipate only a torpedo attack. As the Zeros took off, the crew discovered enemy torpedo wakes off the starboard side as the 2nd Dive Bomber Squadron launched their attack. 3 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros attempted to intercept the American attackers, but to no avail. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck directly on the centerline, just 250 feet forward of the ramp. A massive explosion engulfed the rear of the ship in smoke and flames, leading to a chain of devastating impacts across the flight deck. These successive detonations unleashed havoc on a vessel already on the brink of destruction, culminating in violent internal explosions that tore the hull apart, sending flames soaring into the sky. The bombers scored 2 devastating hits with 1,000-pound bombs on Shoho's forward section. The bombs ignited massive fires on the hangar deck, where armed and fueled Kates were waiting to be launched. The bombs also ripped into the after elevator, exploding within the rear hangar. The second bomb struck just aft of the forward elevator, ensuring that damage in the hangar extended along the entire length of the ship. Meanwhile, torpedo bombers from the 2nd Squadron swooped in from 100 feet, exploiting a gap in Shoho's cruiser screen. The first torpedo hit occurred on the starboard side at the rear. 4 more torpedoes followed on the port side, hitting the midsection just behind the forward elevator, near the fore, and again forward of the elevator. The 5th torpedo struck the starboard side directly across from where the 2nd hit, likely wreaking havoc in the boiler rooms and slowing down the ship. Water poured into the ship, as damage control teams below deck frantically attempted to close off compartments. As the ship was burning, flooding and heavily listing, Yorktown's strike group finally arrived. 6 minutes after the torpedo attack, 24 dive bombers swooped down to strike the crippled vessel. As many as 11 bomb hits were confirmed by Japanese sources. Then, 4 minutes later, another wave of Yorktown's torpedo bombers attacked, claiming multiple hits, with Japanese reports confirming 2, though more likely struck. In less than 30 minutes, Shoho was dead in the water, as a cataclysmic explosion sent flames shooting 400 feet into the sky. The carrier, ablaze and rendered dead in the water, after sustaining at least 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes, sank at 11:35 a.m., with only 203 survivors out of its 834 crew. All 18 of its aircraft were destroyed. The Americans lost 6 aircraft in the engagement. The attack was famously marked by the message, "Scratch one flat top," the first Japanese carrier loss in the war. Shoho's sinking marked Japan's first ship casualty of the war that exceeded a destroyer. By 1450, both American air groups had returned. Learning of the successful strike against the Shoho, Fletcher cancelled plans for a follow-up strike against the carrier's supporting vessels. He was now focused on the still unlocated enemy carriers. However, while the embattled Shohos was slowly sinking, miles to the south, Rear Admiral Crace's flotilla faced its own challenges. That morning, at 8:10 a.m., a Japanese seaplane spotted their group, shifting the focus of the Japanese air assault. Instead of targeting Task Force 17, the Japanese redirected their land-based aircraft against Crace's 6 ships. Reconnaissance floatplanes reported sporadically on the squadron's movement westward. A scout plane identified the force as 1 battleship, 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers, relaying their location to Rear Admiral Yamada's 4th Air Group, based at Vunanakau Airfield near Rabaul. 11 Zeros from the Tainan Air Group provided fighter escort, while 12 Betty bombers, each equipped with a torpedo, launched from Rabaul at 9:50. This strike was soon followed at 11 o'clock by 19 Mitsubishi G3M bombers. The flight path of the first formation lay directly between Crace's squadron and Fletcher's carrier group. Weather played a significant role that day, with Fletcher concealed beneath layers of thick cloud cover and Crace's task group exposed to clear skies. That morning, at 8:40, the lookout aboard the flagship Chicago already reported that a Japanese floatplane, which had been tracking Crace's task group for approximately 30 minutes, had departed. For just over 5 hours, Captain Crace's squadron would experience no further contact with the enemy as they zigzagged westward. A brief moment of alarm arose at 9:40 when radar detected a contact to the northeast, only to reveal itself as a B-17 Flying Fortress. Yet, beneath the surface calm, the Japanese forces were far from idle. Moving at 25 knots in a defensive diamond-shaped formation, Crace's positioning allowed for mutual support and overlapping fields of fire, enhancing their collective defensive capabilities against the incoming aerial assault. At 13:45, Chicago's radar detected enemy aircraft approaching from the southeast, just 27 nautical miles away. The cruiser's CXAM radar failed to identify the altitude of the approaching aircraft, leading to an element of surprise when the Zeros appeared at low altitude. The ships of Crace's squadron opened fire with every available anti-aircraft gun, yet the Zeros, perhaps equally astonished, swiftly retreated, suffering no losses. 30 minutes later, radar detected fast-approaching aircraft, with the range closing to 12 nautical miles within 16 minutes, when the attackers were sighted. The destroyer Perkins's crew initially thought the flash from the aircraft might be a friendly signal light, while the crew of the cruiser Chicago quickly identified it as sunlight, reflecting off hostile planes. It was, in fact, the first wave consisting of 11 single-engine torpedo planes. They launched their attack against the fleet. What ensued was a rapid and intense exchange. 11 Japanese torpedo planes, flying in a V formation. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from a range of 8,200 yards with the ship's forward guns. The initial volleys appeared effective, with reports indicating that the leading plane was struck, bursting into flames and crashing just ahead of Perkins. Another aircraft collided with the flaming wreckage, meeting a similar fate. As the attack progressed, smoke and flames billowed from 2 planes as they released torpedoes toward the Australia. One plane banked sharply toward Australia just before launching its torpedo. A separate aircraft crashed on the starboard quarter of the Australia after passing ahead of Chicago. Several more planes from the port side targeted Chicago with their torpedoes, and one crashed just off the Australia's port quarter. The remaining 2 aircraft, one trailing smoke, continued on, opening fire with machine guns as they maneuvered toward the formation. The entire attack lasted only a few minutes. While Walkie's report credited 4 definite kills and 3 additional aircraft trailing smoke, Chicago's account also noted 5 downed enemy aircraft. The Japanese reported losing 6 aircraft during the operation. All reports converge on one conclusion. Every Japanese torpedo missed its target. Crace's force had been very lucky, for now. Minutes later, Crace's radar picked up a second wave of 12 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers. They approached from astern as the Bettys cleared the area. These aircraft moved rapidly towards Crace's squadron. The crew quickly adjusted and resumed fire on the planes approaching from the rear. Flying at an altitude of 24,000 feet, these bombers passed directly overhead, disappearing from view only after releasing their payload. Captain H.B. Farncombe of the Australia ordered a sharp right turn as soon as the bombers were spotted, avoiding the bombs that had tightly clustered around his ship. Bombs fell perilously close to the Australia, shrouding the ship in smoke, while near misses were also observed near Hobart. The altitude made the bombers difficult targets, leading to a ceasefire at 15:20. Half an hour later, a third wave of 19 bombers, soaring at altitudes between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, launched a high-altitude bombing run. They failed to land any bombs as Crace's ships continued zigzagging to evade the bomb hits. Then, moments after this attack, 3 4-engine planes were spotted. A string of bombs landed just behind the destroyer Farragut. As it turned out, this was a case of friendly fire. Crace identified the bombers as B-26 Marauders, but they were later identified as US Army B-17 Flying Fortresses. The US bombers, en route to target the MO invasion force, mistakenly identified Crace's squadron as the enemy and dropped their bombs on the nearest ship Farragut in the southwest corner of the formation. Fortunately, these bombs were even less accurate than those dropped by the Japanese, sparing the squadron from further damage. The battle was over, and Crace was furious, having recognized US aircraft as the final wave of bombers. As for the Japanese aviators, they were confident in their efforts, mistakenly reporting they had inflicted a lot of damage on Crace's force. They claimed the sinking of a California-class battleship, an Augusta-class cruiser, and heavy damage to a Warspite-class battleship and a Canberra-class cruiser. In Rabaul, dispatchers, swayed by reports from Japanese pilots, cancelled any further planned assaults. It wouldn't be necessary, they thought. In reality, Crace hadn't lost any ships. While the torpedoes and bombs had all missed, Crace's squadron did not emerge unscathed. Both the Australia and Hobart reported 3 men wounded, none seriously. Captain H.L. Howden of Hobart sustained a minor injury when a metal splinter struck his arm. The American ships fared worse. 2 men aboard Chicago were killed, both from head wounds. Several others aboard Chicago were injured, some due to accidental friendly fire from their own ship's anti-aircraft guns during the chaos of battle. Crace, low on fuel and without air cover, withdrew while remaining vigilant against possible aerial attacks. In the battle's aftermath, Lieutenant General George Brett, the responsible air commander, vehemently denied that any American bombs had been dropped on the squadron, leading to tensions between Crace and his Allied counterparts. It wasn't until after the war that the truth emerged, confirming that the bombers were indeed 3 B-17s, led by Captain John A. Roberts of the 19th Bomb Group. As for the battle, by the afternoon, Admiral Takagi learned of Shoho's loss. The sheer number of American aircraft involved in the attack made it clear that 2 US carriers were operating nearby. In response, he redirected his transports. Rather than advancing through Jomard Passage toward Port Moresby, they were ordered to remain north of the Louisiades. Inouye ordered the invasion force targeting Moresby to retreat temporarily. He moved the invasion convoy out of American aircraft range and concentrated his surface combat forces near Rossel Island, preparing for a potential night attack. He also ordered Admiral Goto to split his cruiser force. 2 ships were to remain with the main force, while the other 2 were sent to support the carrier striking force. These decisions marked the southernmost point the Japanese would reach in the war. The dangerous cat and mouse game continued throughout the afternoon, as both commanders realized they needed to take more risks if they wanted to have an advantage against their adversary. It was the morning of May 8th, 1942. Captain Takatsugu Jojima stood on the bridge of the Shōkaku, eyes fixed on the horizon. Reports of incoming American planes had set the crew on edge, as voices murmured in the officers' quarters. Above, a few Zeros vanished into the clouds, ready to defend. Suddenly, the first American torpedo bombers broke through. Jojima ordered evasive action and a sharp turn, as more American dive bombers followed. One of the major engagements of the Battle of the Coral Sea had begun. May 7th had not gone the way either Japan or the United States had intended. The Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk by American dive bombers, marking the first carrier loss of the war. However, miscommunication marred US operations, as their actual targets, the carriers Zuikaku and Shōkaku, eluded Fletcher's main task force. The Japanese side fared no better. After faulty intelligence, Takagi had launched all his aircraft to attack a reported carrier and heavy cruiser. In reality, his assets were wasted an entire morning and early afternoon, attacking the empty oil tanker Neosho and destroyer Sims. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Crace's flotilla, detached by Fletcher, endured Japanese air assaults meant for Task Force 17, and to top it off, a US B-17 bombing run. That afternoon, Fletcher's task force had welcomed back its aviators who had been victorious, sinking the light carrier Shoho. By 1420, Fletcher's task force had rearmed its planes, but refrained from launching further strikes, unsure of the locations of the remaining Japanese carriers. Allied intelligence suggested up to 4 enemy carriers might be involved, and Fletcher decided to remain hidden under the cloud cover, preparing for defense. With Japan's Operation MO falling apart, everything now hinged on the ability of the carrier striking force to locate and destroy the American carriers. In response, Hara became more willing to take risks. With no recent intelligence on the American carrier's location, he ordered a broad search pattern between the southwest and northwest, extending 200 miles out. These search aircraft failed to make contact before being recalled. Hara and Takagi then gambled on a risky Dusk strike using their most experienced crews. By 1630, 12 Val dive bombers and 15 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers flew to the west, in the rough direction of where Takagi and Hara expected a carrier to be. Rain squalls and towering clouds severely hampered the search. The 27 aircraft failed to find the Americans, eventually discarding their payloads and turning back. But the Japanese had come closer than they knew. The Yorktown's radar had detected them, and at 1800, American Wildcats were vectored in to intercept. 6 Japanese bombers were shot down at the cost of 3 Wildcats. The surviving 21 Japanese aircraft, still searching to return to their carriers in the night, had gone off course. They mistook the lights of Lexington for their own. Blinking in Morse code for landing permission, they were instead met by a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Probably just as confused as the US sailors shooting, 3 planes were downed before the survivors fled into the night. By 2300, the surviving aircraft returned to their carriers, although 1 additional attack plane had to ditch into the sea. Out of the 27 aircraft launched, 18 made it back. Upon debriefing, the Japanese pilots reported that Task Force 17 was a mere 40 to 60 miles to the west. The Japanese commanders began planning operations for the following day. Meanwhile, Fletcher weighed his options, considering sending surface ships to engage the Japanese fleet directly. Yet with no clear indication of their location, he decided against splitting his forces, as every ship and aircraft would be needed for the battle expected the following day. On the scorching hot morning of May 8th, Rear Admiral Fletcher rose early after a restless night. He knew the Japanese main carrier force was close by. Shoho's sinking forced the Japanese to delay the Port Moresby invasion. Rear Admiral Hara's desperate Dusk strike the night before failed to locate the US carriers, losing 9 valuable planes in the process. That morning, the weather provided cover to Takagi's fleet, now reinforced with 2 of Goto's cruisers, hidden beneath a cloud-laden cold front moving northeast of Rossel Island. The sailors were issued rice cakes in anticipation of what would inevitably become the decisive day. The carrier force still had 96 operational aircraft, 38 fighters, 33 carrier bombers, and 25 carrier attack planes. Takagi initially hesitated to adopt Hara's recommendation to maneuver eastward, but ultimately agreed to reposition the Japanese carriers northeast of Rossel Island for a more targeted search. Hara focused on conserving aircraft for offensive strikes, rather than conducting a broad reconnaissance sweep, allocating only 7 carrier attack planes for search missions due to rough seas, preventing cruiser float planes from being deployed. At 6:15, Japanese search aircraft took to the skies. In contrast, Fletcher's task force sat exposed in clear sunlight, moving southeast. He still had 117 operational aircraft, 31 fighters, 65 dive bombers, and 21 torpedo bombers. 30 minutes before dawn, 18 reconnaissance planes took off from Lexington's deck to conduct a 360-degree sweep. On board the Yorktown, candy bars were handed out to sailors, giving them something to eat at their battle stations. Captain Frederick C. Sherman anxiously awaited contact reports from his own scouts. Then, at 8:02, Yorktown's radar detected several blips 18 miles to the northwest. Concurrently, a report from the Japanese search plane confirmed the sighting of 2 American carriers, positioned 235 miles from Takagi's force. This critical information was corroborated by intercepted reports by radio intelligence units on both the Lexington and Yorktown, indicating that the Japanese aircraft had successfully located Fletcher's task force. Meanwhile, on the American side, they received a report at 8:20. An American scout plane sighted the Japanese carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku, about 175 miles removed, just within the striking range of the TBD torpedo bombers, moving in opposite direction of the US carriers. No matter the distance, it was decided to launch a full strike and maneuver Task Force 17 towards the contact to minimize the return distance for the strike force. At 9 o'clock, both Yorktown and Lexington's entire task groups were dispatched northward. As the American aircraft were on their way, unbeknownst to the pilots, a lethal force of Japanese aircraft flew high overhead, heading exactly in the opposite direction. Because Takagi too had ordered a full strike against the Yorktown and Lexington. At 9:34, Fitch received a report that the Japanese carriers were 191 miles removed from Task Force 17, prompting him to sail a northeast course to close the distance to the enemy. Whereas the American fleet lay in clear weather, the Japanese fleet had the fortune of being able to hide under cloud cover. Following American naval doctrine, the 2 air groups operated independently, lacking a single strike commander. Yorktown had launched 30 Dauntless dive bombers, 9 Devastator torpedo bombers, and 14 Wildcat fighters. Lexington launched 24 Dauntlesses, 12 Devastators, and 10 Wildcats, approaching separately. At 10:32, Yorktown's bombers spotted the 2 Japanese carriers, 5 miles apart. The Japanese fleet had split into 2 formations. The Zuikaku, protected by the cruisers Myoko and Haguro, along with 3 destroyers, was approximately 11,000 yards ahead of the Shokaku, which was trailing behind with 2 cruisers, Furutaka and Kinugasa, another 11,000 yards astern. Lieutenant Commander William Birch, Jr., leading the Yorktown's 2 SBD squadrons, held his aircraft in a circling pattern, waiting for the torpedo planes to arrive. This decision, aligned with tactical doctrine, aimed to ensure a coordinated assault. However, the ensuing 20-minute delay proved costly, giving the Japanese time to scramble and launch 7 additional fighters, while the carrier Zuikaku slipped away under the cover of a dense squall line. Only 1 fighter from the Yorktown's group managed to sight Zuikaku. In contrast, the Shokaku remained in an area of clearer visibility. Below, Shokaku's captain Takatsugu Jojima continued launching combat air patrols, while Zuikaku too prepared her remaining aircraft for departure under cloud cover. 25 minutes after arriving above the Japanese carriers, Lieutenant Joseph Taylor, commanding a squadron of torpedo planes, led the first strike against the only visible Japanese carrier. They dove towards their targets, breaking through the cloud cover as they closed in on the ship. The pilots tightened their formations, focusing on their target below. With a sudden sharp dive, the torpedo planes dropped quickly, cutting through the sky at a steep angle. Descending through 8,000 feet, the pilots encountered an all-too-familiar issue. Their bomb sights and windshields fogged over, rendering visibility nearly non-existent. Devoid of fighter escorts, the lumbering aircraft faced a storm of anti-aircraft fire and made hasty torpedo drops, but the distance was too great. As the torpedoes raced toward the Shokaku, its commander, Jojima, reacted quickly, steering the carrier hard to port. The torpedo splashed harmlessly into the sea as the carrier evaded the attack. leaving only ripples in the water. Several of the American torpedo planes suffered damage, with one badly hit. 4 more A-6Ms, newly launched from Zuikaku, harassed the retreating planes as they withdrew. High above, Birch's 7-plane squadron initiated their dive. Fierce anti-aircraft fire greeted them as they descended, tracer rounds streaking through the air. All 7 bombs missed their target, plunging harmlessly into the sea. 6 Zero fighters rose to intercept. They were quickly engaged by Wildcats, who swooped in to provide cover for the American bombers. In a coordinated assault, SBD Dauntless dive bombers followed the torpedo bombers, diving from 17,000 feet in tight, deadly arcs. The shriek of their engines cut through the air as they closed in, expertly lining up their targets before releasing their bombs. This squadron was led by Lieutenant Wally Short. It was composed of 17 Dauntless dive bombers. They approached the Shokaku from a better diving position. Plummeting at a steep angle, the Dauntlesses faced relentless harassment from Zeros. Fogged windshields again hampered accuracy. Despite the foggy windshields, the SBDs were more successful. During the attack, their rear division was engaged by A-6Ms from Shokaku's Combat Air Patrol. One of the final dive bombers in the attack run was piloted by Lieutenant John Powers. Powers' plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire from a Zero fighter, and flames erupted from his wing, trailing smoke. Despite the damage, he continued his dive, pressing on through the fire and smoke, bringing his aircraft under 1,000 feet before releasing his bomb. It struck the Shokaku's starboard side near the island, igniting a massive fire on both the flight and hangar decks. The explosion also claimed the plane and the life of Lieutenant John Powers, along with his rear gunner. While the carrier could still recover aircraft, the damage was severe enough to prevent any further launches. A second bomb struck aft, hitting a repair shop on the starboard side and igniting more fires across the flight and hangar decks. The strikes left the Shokaku battered and ablaze, with gaping holes in her flight deck. While most of the American pilots missed their marks, the few hits they managed set off gasoline fires. However, the Japanese damage control teams quickly contained the fires. Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved largely ineffective, resulting in the loss of 2 SBDs, though Wildcats managed to shoot down 2 Zero fighters attempting to intercept the bombers. Though severely damaged, the Shokaku remained afloat. Her structural integrity was intact, and she could still reach speeds of 30 knots. With her flight operations incapacitated and her air group forced to land on the Zuikaku, her captain requested permission to retreat. Granted approval, the Shokaku withdrew from the battle, escorted by 2 destroyers. At 11:30, 30 minutes after the commencement of the first attack, Lexington's planes arrived in the vicinity of Shōkaku. The Lexington Air Group's efforts that day were marked by confusion and frustration. The outbound flight, hindered by disorganization and poor coordination, arrived piecemeal over the target. The squadrons had become separated in the poor weather conditions, and now only 4 dive bombers, 11 torpedo planes, and 6 fighters remained to press the attack. Many failed to locate their quarry entirely. 3 Wildcats and 9 SBD Dauntless dive bombers turned back without ever spotting the enemy. The conditions were chaotic, with towering rain clouds obscuring visibility. The carrier would suddenly appear and just as quickly vanish as pilots navigated through the storm. The scene was marked by poor sightlines and frantic radio chatter, according to eyewitness accounts. Meanwhile, the Japanese maintained 11 Zeros, 4 stationed at 13,000 feet over the battered and limping Shokaku, 3 at 19,000 feet over Zuikaku, and 4 more stationed at lower altitudes, tasked with intercepting the torpedo planes. A Lexington vanguard spotted the Japanese carrier in the distance, surrounded by flak bursts and fires on the deck. Small groups of planes, separated by 5 to 10 minutes, attempted to engage the Japanese fleet. Heavy dogfights broke out between the F-4Fs and Zeros, the skies filled with tracers and the shrieks of engines diving and climbing in the dogged pursuit. Lexington's torpedo and scout planes pressed their attack. The Wildcats struggled to fend the Zeros off, while the slower-moving torpedo planes sought refuge in the mists. A surviving pilot noted during one engagement, the Zero performed its signature zoom climb, baiting him into following. As he pursued, the Zero would climb out of range, flip over at the top, and then dive back at him, leaving him almost stalled and vulnerable to attack. At 11:40, Commander William Alt's 4 SBDs led the assault, drawing the Japanese A-6M's attention and diverting them from the slower torpedo planes. The dive bombers, unable to reach the proper altitude for a full dive bomb attack, opt for glide bombing. Alt's group, despite the chaos around them, maintained their focus, relying on instinct and training to guide them to their target. The 3 high-altitude Zuikaku Zeros engaged the SBDs at 5,500 feet, but 3 dive bombers succeeded in releasing their 1,000-pound bombs, one of which remained stuck on an aircraft. One scored a hit on the starboard side of the flight deck. In the ensuing aerial combat, one A-6M from Shokaku was shot down. At least one Wildcat was likely also lost in the exchange. Then the torpedo bombers targeted Shokaku, but her skipper adeptly maneuvered. 2 torpedo planes approached Shokaku's port bow, prompting the carrier to execute a sharp turn to starboard to present her stern to the attackers. Despite dropping torpedoes from just 400 to 600 yards, both planes missed their target. The Japanese crew, trained for such attacks, reacted swiftly to each incoming threat. As Shokaku's captain executed evasive maneuvers at high speed, dive bombers pushed their attacks to a mere 2,000 feet before releasing their bombs. The planes screamed in for their strikes, but the heavy cloud cover and turbulence made accuracy difficult. The remaining torpedo planes launched their attack from Shokaku's starboard side after the carrier completed a partial turn. Once again, Shokaku turned to outrun the torpedoes, and all missed. Most of Lexington's dive bombers missed their intended targets in the poor visibility. The American planes had dropped their payloads and left the battle scene. The attack was over just as suddenly as it had begun. The US planes turned away, their engines roaring as they headed back toward their carrier, leaving the burning and listing Shokaku behind. In the distance, smoke billowed from the Japanese carrier. The losses for the Americans remained light, with 3 fighters and 1 SBD shot down, while another fighter and 2 SBDs, including Alt's, failed to return to the Lexington. The missing planes were believed to have either crashed or been shot down during the return flight. In exchange, the Japanese fighters claimed 2 SBDs and 3 Wildcats. With her flight deck severely damaged, Shokaku lost 223 crew members and was unable to launch or recover aircraft. Her once sturdy deck was now a smoldering ruin, making further operations impossible. Her fires were contained, while most of her aircraft were transferred to Zuikaku, which re-emerged from a rain squall to aid her sister ship. The outcome of the American strike proved disappointing. The fact none of the US Mark 13 torpedoes hit their target was very telling of their quality and accuracy. Zuikaku, obscured by clouds, remained unscathed. Although Shokaku suffered severe damage from the 3 bomb hits, it was not in imminent danger of sinking. For his courage and for delivering a decisive blow despite the danger, Lieutenant John Powers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. By 1 p.m., Rear Admiral Takagi ordered Shokaku north for repairs at Truk, and Shokaku withdrew from the battle, escorted by 2 destroyers. The Japanese carrier was effectively neutralized from further participation in the battle. She limped back to Truk for repairs, as the damage would keep her out of action until July. However, unbeknownst to the victorious pilots, their carriers were anything but preoccupied with their victory. That morning, 2 minutes after the Japanese carriers had been sighted and the US pilots departed, Japanese Flight Warrant Officer Kenzo Kano spotted Fletcher's task force from his Kate bomber and sent a radio signal intercepted by Lexington. The second serious battle of the day had taken place almost 200 miles to the south. It's a clear, hot morning in the Coral Sea. Sailors aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown go about their duties, the ship cutting smoothly through the calm waters. Above, a few Wildcats patrol the sky. Most of the task force's aircraft had launched against a sighted Japanese fleet over 2 hours ago, and by now were hundreds of miles away. Below deck, tension is thick but contained. Suddenly, radar operators spot incoming planes on their screens. The calm shatters as the klaxon blares, as sailors scramble to take their position. In the distance, a Japanese force prepares for its approach, as the carrier's crews brace for what's to come. In the late morning of May 8, 1942, Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17 launched a major assault against Admiral Takagi's Japanese carrier force, with both the Lexington and Yorktown sending waves of aircraft into the skies. While the attack was fierce, the results of the strike were mixed. Shokaku, though heavily damaged by multiple bomb hits, was not sunk. By 1300, Rear Admiral Takagi ordered the carrier to withdraw to Truk for repairs, effectively neutralizing her for the remainder of the battle. Meanwhile, Zuikaku, obscured by clouds, remained unscathed, and though the Americans had struck a blow, the battle was far from won. As the American pilots returned to their carriers, they were unaware that the Japanese had already begun preparing their response. Just moments after the US aircraft had departed, a Kate bomber spotted Fletcher's task force from the air. But reports were blurry, and the Japanese commanders received contradicting information, unsure where the US carrier force's exact position was. Just like the day before, Takagi decided to take another calculated risk. He launched 69 aircraft, 18 Type 97 torpedo bombers, 33 Type 99 dive bombers, and 18 Type 0 fighters, without confirmation of the American carrier's position. The Japanese strike force, led by Kakuichi Takahashi, was quite diminished due to Takagi's gamble the night before, leading to aerial encounters where Wildcats intercepted Takagi's aircraft looking for the carrier, destroying and damaging several. The Japanese could not afford another setback like that. Takagi gambled that his scouts would soon provide the information needed to guide his attack. His gamble had paid off. One of the Kate bombers which had spotted Fletcher's task force joined the southbound attack group, guiding them toward the American ships before his fuel ran out, sacrificing himself as his plane crashed into the sea. The Americans, fully expecting an attack, had positioned 8 Wildcats and 18 SBD Dauntlesses for combat air patrol. At 10:55, the American radars detected the incoming Japanese force, prompting the launch of additional Wildcats and Dauntlesses to intercept. However, the outer air battle was not in the Americans' favor. The Wildcats failed to intercept the dive bombers before they commenced their dives, and the torpedo bombers evaded detection in the clouds. Rear Admiral Fletcher, watching the events unfold from Yorktown's flag bridge, resigned himself to the ship's anti-aircraft defenses as their last hope. At 11:18, Takahashi's torpedo planes swooped down from the sun. 18 torpedo bombers initiated their attack, 4 of which targeted the Yorktown. The carrier's anti-aircraft fire immediately filled the sky, shredding one of the first attackers. Captain Elliot Buckmaster skillfully maneuvered his ship, advantaged by its tighter turning radius compared to the older Lexington, managing to evade all 8 torpedoes launched at its port quarter. His gunners accurately shot several more aircraft out of the sky. 7 minutes later, 14 dive bombers from Zuikaku zeroed in. Yorktown, speeding through the water at 30 knots, was rocked by the concussive blasts of bombs exploding in the sea nearby, the noise only intensified by the roar of the ship's anti-aircraft guns. While most of the bombs missed, their near hits caused severe damage. Shrapnel sprayed across the deck, and a series of blasts disrupted vital systems. One 550-pound bomb punched through the deck, killing 66 crew members, while another detonated deep within the ship, claiming 37 more lives. It temporarily reduced her speed to 24 knots. Despite the damage, Yorktown survived, maintaining a steady speed. Below deck, damage control teams tried to extinguish the blaze. The ship's crew quickly extinguished the fires and restored full speed. Meanwhile, 3 miles to the north, the Lexington faced her own dire situation. At 11:13, her 5-inch guns unleashed a barrage at incoming Japanese planes. 13 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers attacked in a coordinated hammer and anvil attack, targeting Lexington from both sides of her fore, leaving Captain Sherman with little room to maneuver. Flying just 50 to 200 feet above the water, they dropped their torpedoes a half-mile from their target. As flak tore through the sky, most of the American Wildcat fighters, intended to guard against the higher-flying Vals, instead pursued the now fleeing Kates. Explosions sent towering geysers of water into the air, some higher than the ship's masts. Near misses further weakened the ship, piercing hull plates and rupturing fuel tanks. Lexington's siren malfunctioned, its continuous wail adding to the ship's grim situation, as if it were crying out in agony. The attack, though devastating, lasted less than 20 minutes. Sherman managed to evade the first wave of torpedoes, skillfully adjusting the rudder to outmaneuver the incoming planes. However, as the attackers split to strike both fours simultaneously, it became a desperate game of maneuvering the ship to dodge the deadly weapons. 2 torpedoes now raced toward the port beam, and Sherman braced for the inevitable impact. Yet, the ship was spared. Those torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath the hull. Others missed narrowly, skimming past just 50 yards out on either side. But fortune couldn't hold forever. At 11:20, one torpedo slammed into the carrier's portside forward, near the island. Within moments, 2 more followed, hitting the portside near the fore. The first hit jammed the forward elevators and caused gasoline vapors to spread from damaged fuel tanks. The second hit near the fire rooms caused flooding and a 6-degree list, though this was quickly corrected. Takahashi's dive bombers arrived shortly after the torpedo planes, with 19 dive bombers from Shōkaku targeting Lexington. Then, in quick succession, a smaller 120-pound bomb hit a portside ammunition box near Sherman, who was coordinating the massive carrier to evade the torpedoes slicing through the ocean. Torpedo wakes crisscrossed the water, and bombs rained down around them. A larger 550-pound bomb smashed into the funnel structure behind the bridge. Still, as the Japanese fighters successfully protected the dive bombers from American interceptions, the results were underwhelming. Both bombs caused minor damage, one on the flight deck and another on the smokestack. Efforts to stabilize the stricken Lexington began immediately. Oil ballast was shifted to correct a 7-degree list to port, and damage control teams swiftly patched the torpedo holes. Remarkably, the carrier's engines remained intact, despite flooding in 3 boiler rooms. Then, just 22 minutes after the first torpedo hit the water, the attack abruptly ended. The skies cleared of Japanese planes, and the guns fell silent, their targets gone. The Japanese attack on the USS Yorktown caused less damage than anticipated. Despite suffering 2 torpedo hits and 8 to 10 bomb hits, the crew restored the ship's speed to 28 knots within minutes. Lexington, though heavily damaged, remained operational. Takahashi reported the sinking of a Saratoga-class carrier, struck by 9 torpedoes and 10 bombs. Japanese losses during the battle included 5 dive bombers and 8 torpedo bombers, with additional aircraft ditching or being jettisoned due to damage. Takahashi himself was shot down by escorts returning from the Yorktown strike. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft that returned to Zuikaku, several were jettisoned as beyond repair. The Americans lost 3 fighters and 5 SBDs. After the strikes, Fletcher gave the order to recover damaged aircraft. The US lost another 5 SBDs, 2 TBDs and a Wildcat during recovery. Despite the Americans' expectations of severe damage, both carriers remained operational after the Japanese strike. The Lexington, despite greater damage, appeared battle-worthy, and Yorktown quickly recovered. Misled by inflated damage reports from Takahashi, who claimed to have sunk a Saratoga-class carrier, the Japanese believed they had delivered a decisive blow, though in reality, their strike had fallen short of expectations. Fletcher, assessing the damage to Yorktown and Lexington and the high fighter losses, decided to withdraw due to fuel concerns and the threat of 2 undamaged Japanese carriers. Though both carriers had sustained damage, they managed to maintain their speed, pushing forward at 25 knots and resuming flight operations. By 12:30 p.m., the fires were under control, allowing the ship's air group to land. However, 15 minutes later, a bit over an hour after the battle had ceased, an internal explosion ripped through Lexington. The deep rumble from within the ship signaled a new disaster, as a series of explosions caused uncontrollable blazes. smoke billowed from the flight deck elevator. An accumulation of gasoline vapors leaking from damaged storage tanks, ignited by a motor generator left unattended, caused a chain of devastating fires aboard the ship. The flames spread rapidly. Amidst the increasing chaos and destruction, Lexington's crew continued landing aircraft. However, at 14:45, a second major explosion rocked the ship, sending a thick plume of dark smoke into the sky. Below, the bulkhead in the forward engine room glowed white-hot as temperatures surged to a blistering 160 degrees. The fire tenders tried to control the fire, but the blaze reached the ship's lower levels, triggering secondary explosions that overwhelmed any attempts at damage control. Fletcher learned of Lexington's distress calls and dispatched the destroyer Morris, which pulled up next to the carrier to battle the inferno with fire hoses. 19 aircraft still in the air were redirected to land on the Yorktown's deck. Although reluctant to concede defeat, Captain Sherman realized there was no alternative. As the carrier lay motionless, crippled by the damage it had sustained, Sherman gave the order to abandon the slightly tilted ship at 17:07. He later wrote, "There was not the slightest panic or disorder among my men. I was proud of them." Captain Sherman, the last of the 2,735 officers and crew, was safely taken aboard. Later that evening, Admiral Fletcher ordered the destroyer Phelps to finish the job. The destroyer launched a salvo of 5 torpedoes. The carrier sank at 19:52, with 216 of its crew and 36 aircraft lost during the battle and subsequent explosions. Both the American and Japanese fleets, having exaggerated their inflicted damage, began to withdraw, Americans moving south and the Japanese heading north. Admiral Inoue, believing he had sunk 2 US carriers and with Crace's group moving away, considered the path to Port Moresby clear. Yet, having suffered considerable losses to his air power and facing continued threats from land-based aircraft, the cautious admiral ordered Takagi's forces to withdraw, delaying the invasion of Port Moresby until after the planned Midway operation. His decision was quickly overruled by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Navy's commander-in-chief, who ordered Takagi and Goto to return and eliminate the remaining Allied forces. They spent the following day searching and pursuing the US task force. By May 10th at 1300, Takagi realized the enemy was gone and decided to return to Rabaul, a decision begrudgingly supported by Yamamoto. After the battle, Fletcher's task force had altered its course eastward, leaving the Coral Sea and heading south of New Caledonia. Nimitz directed Fletcher to refuel at Tongatabu and then return Yorktown to Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, Crace's task force, unaware of Fletcher's status, deduced that the task force had left the area. By May 10th at 1 a.m., with no reports of advancing Japanese ships, Crace headed towards Australia and arrived at Sid Harbor the following day. It wasn't until that day those poor survivors of the drifting Neosho, the oiler, which was attacked 4 days earlier by a Japanese air attack, were spotted by a PBY aircraft. 109 survivors ended up being rescued by the destroyer Henley, which then scuttled the tanker. That same day, the Yorktown detached from its escorting cruisers, heading for Pearl Harbor to undergo crucial repairs, just in time to participate in the pivotal Battle of Midway the following month. With the loss of the Lexington, the Japanese secured a tactical victory, but the broader outcome favored the United States strategically. For the first time since the war began, a Japanese invasion had been thwarted, forcing troop-laden transports to turn back to Rabaul. Additionally, their losses, 77 aircraft and 1,074 men, nearly double those of the Americans, were more than the country could sustain. Crucially, 2 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, were rendered unavailable for the upcoming Battle of Midway. Shōkaku would need 2 months for repairs, almost capsizing as it arrived in Kura Harbor, and Zuikaku was without sufficient aircraft or trained air crews. The repercussions of these losses would be felt deeply in the battles to come. Meanwhile, Halsey's Task Force 16 reached the South Pacific and moved to contest the Japanese approach to Nauru and Ocean Island. On May 15th, after learning of an impending Japanese operation against Midway, Nimitz instructed Halsey to ensure Japanese scouts sighted his ships before returning to Pearl Harbor. Halsey's feint was successful. On May 15th, a reconnaissance plane spotted Task Force 16, prompting Inoue to cancel the attack on Port Moresby and retreat to Rabaul. Captain Frederick Sherman shared in this assessment, writing, "The Battle of the Coral Sea was the turning point in the war and a milestone in history." The significance of the Coral Sea engagement lies not only in its outcome, but also in its unprecedented nature. It was the first naval battle where opposing fleets never sighted each other, signaling the rise of naval aviation as the dominant force in warfare at sea. Within a month, both sides would meet again at the famous Battle of Midway. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.